The wind that wasn't wind moved across the glass of the Lyrian Hall of Concord and made the light look tired. Chancellor Urith Venn stood with his palms together, not in prayer but in the ancient habit of judges in his culture, thumbs touching, fingers lightly apart, a gesture that meant, "I will listen longer than I will speak." Outside, the blue-white filament of the marshalling field flickered in the high stratosphere like a heartbeat seen through skin. Somewhere within the flicker, a world was ending. "They've crossed the Pelian line," whispered his military attaché. The woman had a voice trained to sound unafraid, and it betrayed her now. 17 carriers. One of them it's using the same spectrum we thought we sterilized after Raylock. The Chancellor blinked, then blinked again more slowly so his eyes would have time to hold the images the screens gave him. There was no beauty in them. There was only pattern and speed, and the false color of weapons doing work faster than language could keep up. The enemy looked like braided glass. The Heliarch Network's ships didn't turn. They swarmed on the mathematics of mycelia, blooming angles where there should have been arcs, drinking momentum from the same places planets drank moons. Urith had signed treaties about the Heliarch Network before he'd ever seen them. It had seemed wise to call them by the name they had taken for themselves. It had seemed respectful. Now he tasted the word and spat it silently. A name is a costume for a hunger. "Casualties," he said, and he wanted the answer to be less than truth, the way stories had been when he was a child and his mother had hid the endings for a week so he'd sleep. "Projection says 90 million if they take the orbital farms," the attaché said. "If their ground seeding protocol holds, we lose a third of the equatorial band before we stabilize. If we stabilize, sir, Chancellor." He turned from the window. The Hall of Concord was shaped like a bowl and a lung and a courtroom, and none of those things all the way. The lawmakers stood in terraces, the scholars had their alcoves, the captains their cold metal benches. Everyone was careful not to look at the clock because clocks are just a way to measure regret. "We have exhausted every instrument," Urith said, and his voice carried the way it always did in this building, because the builders had tuned the stone to the pitch of responsibility. "We sanctioned, we negotiated, we offered corridor passage, we offered joint jurisdiction, we abided by the core accords." He drew breath. "There is one instrument left. It is the least civilized of all of them." The chamber held silence the way a mouth holds air before speech. Everyone knew what it meant. Everyone knew the old stories, the whispers from outer thread space, the rumors about the Deathworlders who had flourished not by avoiding danger but by breeding with it. There were quotes in dusty books from philosophers who had been laughed at. There were maps with blank edges and footnotes about why the blank was good for you. A senator with silver threads in his skin stood. "You would invite the Punishers," he said. "You would bring wolves into the nursery, Chancellor." Urith found his hands had opened, not clasped, and he didn't remember telling them to. "I would invite neighbors to a fire," he said. "If the neighbors are wolves, perhaps it is because the fire is one wolves know how to put out." The vote did not take long because fear is efficient when it is honest. The distress beacon took longer because dignity is thorough even at the edge of death. The text traveled along the sanction bands, framed in the correct honorifics, encoded for civility, translated into every polite tongue the galaxy had agreed were polite enough to matter. It said help, and it promised trade, and it offered the same things you offer when you know you have nothing left to offer, the future and your gratitude. 42 replies came in the first 3 days. Their words were immaculate. Their punctuation was better than their mercy. They asked for time to convene. They asked for time to verify and cross-verify. They asked for time as if time had ever asked for them. On the 4th day, when the Heliarch lattice burned a hole through the orbital farms above the southern ocean and the nutrient gas went up like a city inhaling lightning, a 43rd reply arrived. It wasn't on any sanctioned band. It was on the one under everything, the one you feel in the bones you broke as a teenager. It arrived without the protocols that warn a doorway it is about to open. Received your SOS. En route. Don't waste time prepping committees. Admiral Maya Halden, Terran Coalition Fleet. Urith read it twice because the first time his intellect had refused to let it be seen. It was too short to carry the weight of the world. It was too bare to be proper. It had no preamble. It had no seals. It didn't even have the right rhythm. And beneath the words there was velocity, the ghost of an arrival so soon it felt like a lie hope tells the irrational. "Do we have a file on Terrans?" asked the attaché. "We have stories," said a historian from the third terrace. Her voice trembled like old temples. "They come from worlds that ask much of the bodies that live there. They make institutions because their weather does not. Their proverbs are sharp enough to cut wire." "External verification?" a captain asked, as if the question could solder his will. "Externality is arriving," said the communications deck, and their screens began to hum. The first Terran ship breached the high thermals an hour before anyone thought it was possible for a thing with mass and intention. It didn't glint like Lyrian hulls. It absorbed light like a thought that refused to be seen. It came alone, and then it was not alone because the shape of it unfolded, and each unfolding had daughters, and each daughter had teeth. 12, then 19, then a number that made the count subsystem stutter and switch to the language hammers were named in. The heliarch lattice shifted to meet them. It moved the way mold moves on bread when the bread is a continent. The channel opened without permission asked. The voice that came through had warmth but not padding. It came like someone who had learned to be kind while being busy. "Lyrian Command, this is Halden," said the voice. "We see your parasite problem. We're going to start by spoiling their seed lines. Don't put anything delicate between us and the sea." "Our protocols," Urith began. "Chancellor, with respect," said Halden, and Urith felt the words make a space for him while simultaneously moving past him. "This is going to get loud. Question for you, where can we kill them fastest without killing your people?" A map bloomed across the shared holo. It was shameful how beautiful it was. It rendered all the things that had been complicated into a grammar of necessities. The Terrans had studied something deeper than tactics. They had noticed, in the way predators notice, that under everything is a line between children and what would eat them. "We have refugees in the equatorial wards," said the attaché. 2 million in tether stacks along the southern night side. "Copy. Those are safe if we do this right. We'll burn their locomotion nodes above the farms and the tide lifts. You'll get shock waves, you'll lose glass, you won't lose lungs. How do you propose to?" said a senator, trying to get his skepticism out ahead of the physics. "Watch," said Halden. The ships moved like hands taking a stick from a violent child without breaking the child. They cut the heliarch lattice in 5 places while threading themselves into angles the Lyrian long-range guns called illegal because the angles had more bravery than permission. Urith watched filaments go dark. He watched colonnades of force collapse like a language forgetting verbs. He watched something ugly in himself unclench. The first ground seeding attempt came in through the polar gate 8 minutes later. The heliarch used spore rock, slow and fat and boring, the kind of threat bureaucrats love because it punishes the patient. The Terrans did not siege the spore rock. They fell with it. They flew in its shadow, used its drag as a cushion, split it in the seam engineering drafts never show, and then they made a choice Urith would think about in the long nights that were coming. They drove the burning halves into the ocean beyond the wards and let the water rage so the city would not. Sirens went up, and then the sirens went down. The Lyrian emergency boards flickered red, 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 then amber like a breath someone had convinced themselves would never be air again. When the smoke from the orbital farms finally stopped looking like a god's drawing of grief, the heliarch network flickered on the scopes in several places at once, and then in fewer places, and then in one place that thought it was still many. The Terrans folded space around that place like a grandmother folding a blanket that had seen too many winters and too much sleep. When they unfolded it, there was nothing in the blanket that could hurt anyone. "Primary infestation neutralized," said a lieutenant on the Terran bridge. He sounded young enough to still be surprised by what discipline can make possible. "Don't congratulate the air," said Halden. Chancellor, what's your worst case if they've infiltrated governance? It was a vulgar question to ask in public. It was a physician cutting on the front steps of the hospital. Urith made himself answer in the voice reserved for laws and deaths. If they have penetrated the civil ministries, we lose response time, we lose truth. We lose the right to trust each other. If they have penetrated defense, we lose everything. Copy, said Halden. We'll run a screen. You require authorization, said the senator with the silver threads, and the way he said require was the way a child says always. Senator, I require that your children eat tonight, said Halden, and Urith made the decision he had known he would make since morning, since months ago, since he took this office and learned that its oath costs more than the ceremony where you swear it. Admiral, he said, proceed, we'll answer for it. It is a strange thing to watch a civilization be grateful for an act it simultaneously calls a crime. The Terran security teams appeared in the civil ministries like patients appearing in an argument. Their tools did not look like weapons, and they made the look into a lie quickly. They scanned for the Heliarch's threads in places where hospitality had made the Lyrians soft, in the tea rooms where lobbyists met with ministers, in the learning dens where interns stayed too late and learned too much and then too little, in the sanctum of the civil registry where names can be broken and put back different. They found 13. 13 is not a large number until you put it into the right sentence. 13 people with the authority to tell true soldiers to wait. They were removed. The euphemism is tidy. The reality was precise and extremely not polite. Some were lifted sobbing. Some were lifted smiling the way broken things sometimes smile. One tried to explain that his choices had been rational within the framework of preserving core economic functionalities. The Terran operator who held him upright while the scanner finished looked at him as if watching rain explain itself. All that first day the work continued, and when the sun struck the city's glass with the particular cruelty it reserves for mornings after dread, the Heliarch network was gone from the sky above Lyra's prime. The air was still dishonored by what it had held. The water would be wrong for a while. The city would have different names for the same corners and the same names for different griefs. But the children would eat. The children would have arguments about whether the Terrans were wolves or neighbors, and those arguments would all be better for being held in rooms whose ceilings hadn't fallen on them. Urith slept for 19 minutes in a chair older than his grandmother. He woke with his neck angry at him and his skin tasting like electricity. The message light pulsed. He wanted it to be a grocery list. He opened it. Chancellor, said Halden. Her hair was pulled back now and there was blood drying at the edge of her jaw. He didn't think it was hers. You have 4 other systems flagged with seed lattices. We're not going to conference. We're going to harvest. You can come or watch. If you try to stop us, we will be too busy to explain why we cannot stop. What of the Accords? Urith said, because old words sometimes insist on being spoken even when they are no longer useful. The Accords didn't put fire out today, said Halden. They were a good set of hopes. We bring water or axes if the fires got into the beams. There are arguments Urith could have made about precedent, about sovereignty, about what happens to law when law does not help. He had made them his whole life and won respect with them even when he lost outcomes. He thought about them and let them go like birds you finally acknowledge are not yours to keep. You will keep the refugees safe, he said. We will keep who we can, said Halden, and that sentence told the truth without begging for forgiveness, which is its own kind of mercy. There is a thing we Terrans say in the wardrooms when someone wants to draw up a charter while the leak is still leaking. Paperwork is a coffin if you sign it before you save the patient. We'll file after. Then go, said Urith. They went. The Lyrian fleet followed at the edge of possibility, not to lead, not to coordinate, but to bear witness and to be taught without a chalkboard. They watched the Terrans collapse a seed silo above Mayan's rings not with bombs but with translation, turning the lattice's language against itself, making its grammar mean 0. They watched a ship called Quiet Work angle itself into a position Every physics professor in the free academies had claimed a ship could not angle itself into, and then fire a weapon that did not look like a weapon, just a way of asking the universe to be simpler in a narrow place. They watched what it means in practice to believe that swift duty is softer than slow virtue. In the short dark between one cleanse and the next, Urith stood in a Terran wardroom. It was not pretty. It had been designed by people who had learned that pretty is sometimes what you do instead of clean. The tables were scarred with maps remembered in cutlery. There was a plant in the corner that was not thriving and not giving up. Halden handed him a metal cup of something the color of decisions. "You're a teacher," she said, not asking. "I was," he said, "before the world wanted me for a different job." "You can be both," she said. "We are, on a good day, the lessons are uglier out here, but the subject is the same." "What subject is that, Admiral?" "How to live with other people," she said, and her mouth was gentle when she said it in a way that the rest of her wasn't allowed to be. "We have a history. We learned some things the way children learn stoves, by touching it too soon. We made laws. We broke them when they were wrong. We broke them when it was convenient. Those are not the same breaks. We try to remember the difference. Some of us become very particular about it." "You broke many today," Urith said. "We will answer for it." "You will," she said. "Because you can. That is the part of this I cannot do for you, and the part I would not if I could. I can take the bugs out of your ceiling. I cannot teach your house how to cook. That is your duty. Duty is a kind of love for strangers you never meet." He took a breath that felt like it had been earned by someone else and loaned to him. "Our council will call you criminals," he said, and hated the shape of the sentence even as he knew it would be true. "Councils have to have someone to blame," she said. "It is one of the ways they keep their mirrors clean. Tell them we are busy. Tell them they can send subpoenas to the edge of the crater and see if the crater will sign for them." He made a sound that was almost a laugh and almost a sob and satisfied neither urge. "There is a line in an old book," he said softly, and her head tipped to listen the way soldiers listen when they are tired and want something to hold in their mouths on the next march. "It says, 'The law is an agreement we make with tomorrow. Sometimes tomorrow misses the meeting.' Write it down," she said. "Put it in your new agreement. Put in a clause that says, when tomorrow misses the meeting, you are permitted to save today. Then hire judges who have seen fire, and teachers who have eaten ration bread without hating the people who handed it to them." The map on the wall lit again. The Heliarch had found a new angle through an old corridor because predators are studious when you are beautiful. The wardroom was not a place for goodbyes. "Admiral," Urith said, "if you need anything we can give. We need you to remember courage after we leave," she said. "We need you to learn speed, not the kind our ships do. The kind that happens inside a city when someone shouts and you do not walk toward a committee, you run toward the shouting with a blanket and a law you haven't written yet. We need you to differentiate mercy from permission. We need you to know the price of hesitating and the price of haste, and pay the cheaper one without writing poetry about it. We need you to stop loving how clean your hands look in photographs." He closed his eyes. He did not close them to sleep. When the Terrans left Lyra's sky again, they left it like they had left it the first time, quieter than it deserved and safer than it would admit. The refugees learned to sleep without counting. The civil registry learned to lock its doors. The Hall of Concord learned a new echo, one where words ran faster. The Heliarch learned something too, and Urith feared that learning more than he feared their hunger. On the 9th night, the Council of Systems met to condemn the intervention it had called for without saying so. The speeches were spectacular. No one speaks better than a man who has discovered that rhetoric can varnish a casket. Urith spoke last. He spoke as a teacher and a judge and a man who had promised to keep more promises than anyone should be required to keep. He told them about the orphans who had not become orphans. He told them about the ministries that now could be blamed for long, slow, boring work again. He told them about 13 names he would never speak in public, but would carry in his pocket until the day he died. He told them about the ocean and the spore rock and the plant in the corner of the Terran wardroom that was not thriving and not giving up. Condemn them, he said finally, and the word condemn sat on his tongue like a coin he refused to spend. Condemn them for showing us how slow we have become. Condemn them for putting a mirror in our hands while the fire still smelled of furniture. Condemn them, if you must, for not making us feel dignified while they saved our children. And then, after you are done condemning, write a law that permits a hand to break a window when the smoke has eaten the key. They voted how men vote when the vote costs less than what it buys. And when it was done, Urith walked home through streets where boys were arguing about whether Terrans drank real coffee or some dark engine fluid that tasted like war. He loved them so much then he could scarcely breathe. A small girl had drawn a ship on the wall of his building. It was the wrong shape, because children are better at essence than angles. Under it, in careful letters, she had written, "They came." He put his hand on the wall. He let drywall dust make a pilgrim mark on his skin. He slept that night and dreamed of a house with new beams and a ladder always close to the window, and of a book with a page that would not stay blank. In the morning, the message light pulsed again. He opened it. "Chancellor," said Halden, "we are moving on the others. There is something I need you to see when this is over. It won't fit in a report. It will not fit in eloquence. When your council is finished condemning, come to the edge where your maps get shy." The map on his wall did the thing it had not done since he was a boy studying planets he thought he would never touch. It grew a margin. It grew a promise. He sent a single sentence back. It took him a long time to choose the words, not because he did not know what to say, but because he wanted to be sure they would last without him. "Bring me to the place where the law learns courage." Her reply was a set of coordinates and a phrase that would become a proverb in his city before the year turned mean again. "Don't be late." He was not. And the first thing he learned, when he saw what waited at the edge, was that the Heliarch had not been the worst lesson, only the first one. The first thing he learned was that the maps had not been drawn with survival in mind. They had been drawn with politics in mind, and politics is a cartography of pride. The coordinates Halden had sent placed him on a transport that shuddered when it folded into a corridor no Lyrian vessel would have trusted. The stars on the other side looked wrong, not because they were strangers, but because they looked too close to each other, like gossiping neighbors leaning over a fence. The Terran flagship hung in the middle of that intimacy. It was not built to please the eyes. Its hull looked as if it had been hammered into shape by a disagreement between engineers and storms. The name along its flank was written in a language that sounded like someone chewing grit. Indomitable. The letters caught light but did not keep it. They received him in a room that had no chairs for ceremony. There was a table bolted to the deck, scuffed and honest. Halden was there, flanked by people whose faces carried different climates. One had the pale calm of someone raised where the air is thin, another the skin-deep warmth of a place that grows citrus even when the soil is tired. They all had the same eyes, alert but with a layer of softness for those they did not yet have to fight. "Chancellor," Halden said, and gestured for him to stand where the holo could pour itself over both of them. It was the galaxy, but it looked like it had been turned inside out. Systems that should have been comfortably neutral glowed with a pulse that was not natural. 17 systems, seed lattices or infiltrations confirmed. We're already in 6. We'll be done with the rest before your council finishes the second round of condemnations. He stared at the map. "This is farther than I thought the network's hunger reached." Halden's mouth tilted. "Hunger doesn't care about your thoughts, Chancellor. It cares about corridors, supply lines, and how polite the sentinels are." The first strike they showed him was the Torvali's Reach, an archipelago of orbital cities around a star so young its light still had a child's harshness. The Reach had refused Lyrian calls for mutual defense only weeks before the network appeared. Too far, they had said, too small a threat. When the Terrans arrived, the network was 3 days from seeding their population habitats. "Why help them?" he asked, more as a confession than a challenge. "Because they are alive," said a Terran tactician without looking away from the feed. "And because one day they might be someone else's shield instead of someone else's meal." The Torvali's defense fleet had been outnumbered 3-1. The Terrans broke the network's formation by diving between the arcs of the stations, forcing the invaders to scatter or risk burning civilians. Then they picked the scattered pieces apart in an order that made no sense to Lyrian military doctrine: fastest first, largest last, until nothing with hostile intent remained. The Torvali's prime minister sent an encrypted thank you. The next day, her cabinet filed a joint protest with the Galactic Council about the violation of their sovereign space. Urith felt a sour pride that they had survived long enough to be that foolish. He followed the Terrans to the next system, then the next. In Viga's belt, where mining stations were spread thin across 1,000 rocks, the network had set up a forward base. Terran procedure: identify every possible hiding place, then remove all of them. 17,000 asteroids gone in minutes. The miners screamed at the loss of their livelihood until they saw the schematics of how many seed lattices could have been hidden there, how quickly they could have turned the miners into hosts. "You always go to the root," Urith said quietly. Halden nodded. "Roots grow back if you leave any." In the Illyria clade, the network's infiltrators had embedded themselves so deeply in government that the planetary guard answered to them without knowing it. The Terrans' screening took less than a day. 92 officials removed, no civilians touched. The streets were quiet for the first time in months. By the time they reached the 14th system, Urith stopped being surprised at the speed. What surprised him was the precision. The way Terran firepower, so blunt in reputation, could thread itself between an enemy bunker and a hospital wall without scarring the plaster. They called it surgical, but the metaphor was too clean. Surgery is still an art done in quiet rooms. This was war in crowded streets, and yet it carried a surgeon's restraint. In the stolen hours between strikes, Halden talked to him, not about tactics, but about the law. "You asked me once why we break it," she said as they sat over cups of bitter black drink that Terrans seemed to run on. "The law is important, but when the law becomes a fence that keeps you from stopping a wolf, you take the fence down. Then when the wolf is gone, you build the fence better." Urith thought of the council's chambers, of the debates about the Terran problem, of the way representatives could hide behind clauses as if clauses were shields. And if the wolf comes back before the fence is rebuilt, her eyes held him. Then you keep the axe handy. The final 3 systems were the hardest. By then, the network knew the Terrans were coming. They fortified, they seeded faster, they moved their infiltrators deeper. But the Terrans were relentless. In some places, they burned infrastructure the locals had spent generations building. In others, they left resources intact but tore out every line the network could use. The moral calculus was always brutal. What could be spared, what could not, what price was worth paying so there would still be a price to pay tomorrow. When it was over, 17 systems were clean. Not clean in the bureaucratic sense, reports filed, cases closed, but in the literal sense, no more seed lattices, no infiltrators, no vectors for the network to use. Clean in the way a battlefield is when nothing left on it can still harm you. The victory was not quiet. The Galactic Council's outrage filled every sanctioned channel. Protests, legal summonses, demands for Terran surrender. Urith watched the feeds in the Terran wardroom as messages scrolled in from civilizations that owed their continued existence to the very people they now wanted tried for crimes. "They can shout," Halden said, shutting the feed off with a flick of her hand. "We'll be gone before the echo fades, and if they are lucky, they'll never need us again." Urith wanted to tell her they would need them again. He wanted to ask if she would come, but he had learned enough of Terran ways to know the answer would not be given in words. When they returned to Lyrian space, the stars felt closer. The corridors between them seemed shorter. The law still lay where it had been, but Urith felt its weight differently now. It was no longer just an agreement with tomorrow. It was also a question for today. What will you do when there is no time to wait for tomorrow? The council would meet soon to condemn, to posture, to write resolutions that would not stop the next wolf. He would be there, but he would not stand behind the fence. And when the pulse came on the old channel, the under-everything channel, He would be ready to answer without asking anyone's permission. The council chamber was built to impress. It was a cathedral of order, a theater for the idea that reason could be dressed in marble and made permanent. 17 tiers of delegates rose in a spiral around the central dais, each tier representing a cluster of worlds bound by the core accords. At the highest point, the speaker's chair loomed like the judgment of history. Urith had stood here many times before. He had defended trade agreements, negotiated border treaties, even argued procedural reforms. Those speeches had been games even when the stakes were dressed in solemn language. Today was not a game. The docket listed the session as the Terran incursions. The language alone was a conviction. Incursion, not intervention. Violation, not salvation. Behind the formal charge was a network of political interests, civilizations embarrassed by their helplessness, allies humiliated that strangers had done what they would not, enemies too frightened to admit the danger had been real. Speaker Varen, tall and silver-scaled, gavelled the session open. The council recognizes the representative from the Lyrian Concord. Urith stepped into the circle. The light caught the edges of his robe, throwing his shadow across the floor in a shape he did not recognize. Shadows are always honest, he thought, because they cannot pretend to be smaller than they are. Honored colleagues, he began, his voice measured. I am here to speak of events you have all heard of, and many of you have survived because of them. The Terran coalition entered 17 sovereign systems without authorization, without adherence to the core accords, and without submitting to this body's oversight. They engaged in combat operations, destroyed infrastructure, and removed officials from power. They broke your laws. He paused. Every ear was waiting for the condemnation they expected. He gave them the truth instead. They also removed the Heliarch network from every one of those systems. They eradicated the seed lattices. They dismantled the infiltration webs. They did what none of us could or would do, and they did it without losing a single civilian life. A murmur swelled in the tiers. Some delegates nodded. Others whispered to aides, their expressions sharp with political calculus. Representative Jareen of the Varric combine rose. Representative Urith, you admit the Terrans violated our laws. Do you also admit that allowing such violations sets a dangerous precedent? Any species with sufficient force could claim necessity and trample our sovereignty. Urith met Jareen's gaze. Representative, the Heliarch were already trampling your sovereignty. They did it in silence, wearing the faces of your own officials. You had a precedent already. It was death. The Terrans replaced it with survival. A ripple of disquiet moved through the chamber. Sovereignty was a sacred word here, one used to shield as often as to protect. He could feel the air tighten. The room was not built for this kind of honesty. Another delegate rose, this one from the Illyria clade, her voice clipped with practiced disdain. Even if their actions were effective, effectiveness does not excuse illegality. If we abandon the law in the name of expedience, we abandon civilization itself. Urith let the silence after her words linger, then spoke in a tone that made the chamber lean forward. Civilization is not marble columns and procedural votes. It is the protection of the innocent. If your laws cannot serve that purpose in the hour of need, they are not civilization, they are theater. The speaker shifted uncomfortably but allowed him to continue. That was unusual. Perhaps even Varen wanted to hear where this would go. I will not pretend the Terrans' methods were gentle. They were not. They acted without asking permission because permission was a luxury we could not afford. They made choices that we would have debated for months while the network hollowed us out from the inside. Yes, they broke our rules, and because they did, my people are alive. The murmurs grew into arguments. A few voices shouted for order. Others shouted for prosecution. Some demanded gratitude. Urith stood in the middle of it and thought about Haldan's words. Tell them they can send subpoenas to the edge of the crater. The speaker brought the gavel down 3 times, the sound sharp enough to sting. This council will vote on a resolution condemning the Terran coalition and demanding their surrender to lawful authorities. Urith felt the choice in his bones before the vote began. When it came, the tally was close, 102 in favor, 98 against. The resolution passed. The speaker turned to him. Representative Urith, will the Lyrian Concord comply with this resolution? He stepped into the center of the circle, feeling every eye on him. No, Speaker. The Lyrian Concord withdraws from this council, effective immediately. We will not stand with those who would prosecute our saviors. Gasps, shouts, outrage, but also he noticed 17 delegations standing one after another to declare their withdrawal as well. The chamber became a storm of voices, but Urith no longer needed to hear them. His course was set. When he left the chamber, he didn't look back. Some doors should be closed without nostalgia. Outside, his aide caught up, breathless. Sir, a transmission from the Terrans. It's on that old channel. He took the device, the pulse of the message still fresh. Halden's voice came through, calm and unadorned. Heard about your vote. Sorry for the diplomatic mess. But if you need us again, you know where to find us. Urith stood for a long moment, listening to the hum of the corridor. The council's marble halls were behind him. Somewhere out there was the edge of the map, and beyond it, people who did not wait for permission to do what had to be done. He sent back a single reply. We will call Admiral, and we will not be late. The convoy slipped into the void between charted space and the territories, marked only by cautionary notes on ancient navigators' maps. The Lyrian flagship was smaller than its escorts, but its presence was symbolic. Urith's place was no longer in the marble chambers of the council, but in the quiet corridors where decisions were made with action, not applause. The Free Systems Alliance had no anthem, no ceremonial robes. It was a coalition born of necessity, 17 civilizations that had walked out of the council chamber with the same understanding. Survival first, legality second. The Terrans had no seats in the alliance, but they were the axis around which it spun. Halden had sent the coordinates without explanation. That was her way. The Free Systems Task Force emerged from fold space to find a gas giant the color of tarnished copper, ringed with debris that shimmered like dust caught in the breath of a star. The debris was not natural. Urith recognized the outlines of orbital habitats, research stations, dry docks, all gutted, all dead. Heliarch activity, he asked as the sensor returns built their lattice of bad news. Not this time, Halden's voice came over the wideband. This is worse. The tactical holo shifted, showing a tight cluster of habitable moons, each glowing faintly in the infrared like cooling embers. Refugee traffic from these moons spiked a month ago, she continued. We followed the trail, found evidence of systematic collapse, political infrastructure, supply chain, not the network style, too human. Urith frowned. Piracy. Pirates don't dismantle governments before they take the food, Halden said. This is a civil implosion. The locals are eating themselves alive while their neighbors watch. On the surface of the nearest moon, images streamed in from Terran reconnaissance. Bread lines curling around buildings painted with the insignia of rival factions. Children carrying rifles too heavy for their shoulders. Barricades made from school desks. It was the kind of war that wasn't tidy enough to name. 1,000 grievances layered until no one could remember what the first injury had been. This is not our fight, said one of the Alliance captains on a secure channel. They're not asking for help. They didn't ask the Heliarch for help either, Halden said. Didn't stop the infestation. We can't build a shield wall for the galaxy and leave holes this big in it. Urith listened to the arguments that followed. Legal jurisdiction, resource strain, the risk of being seen as conquerors instead of rescuers. It was the same song the Council had played, only in a different key. The Alliance had left the marble halls, but the old reflexes still whispered in their bones. When the channel went quiet, Urith spoke. If we do nothing, we inherit the consequences. If their collapse births something worse, it will not stop at their moons. We can pretend our hands are clean until we have to clean blood off them. Halden didn't thank him. She just said, Good. You're starting to sound like someone who's seen fire. The Terran plan unfolded with the kind of simplicity that only hides complexity. secure the main supply hubs, neutralize the armed factions targeting civilians, and establish corridors for aid distribution. But the philosophical line was sharper here than in the war against the network. These were not alien parasites. These were people destroying themselves. The first landings were met with sporadic gunfire, more panic than aim. Terran infantry moved like shadows between buildings, dismantling heavy weapons with the same economy of motion they used to breach a network seed node. But here, every face behind a rifle was a face that could be reasoned with, if reason had time to work. Urith walked with a Terran liaison through the ruins of a civic center. Its council chamber burned out, the dais collapsed into ash. Once, the liaison said, this was the room where they argued about tax rates and school curriculums. Now it's where they executed whoever spoke the wrong faction's slogans. Do you intend to reinstall their old government? Urith asked. The Terran shook his head. Not our place. We're here to stop the bleeding. After that, they choose. But we'll make sure they are choosing without a gun to their head or a famine in their gut. By the fourth day, the largest militias had disbanded, their leaders either captured or fleeing. Terran medics worked alongside Alliance volunteers to reopen hospitals. Convoys of food moved under heavy escort, their drivers wearing expressions that had forgotten how to expect tomorrow. Still, the resistance to outside intervention was fierce in the courts of opinion. Broadcasts on surviving local networks painted the Terrans as occupiers. A street mural showed a Terran dropship as a bird of prey, talons dripping oil. Urith stood before it with Halden one evening, the two of them silent until the sun sank low enough to paint the wall in shadow. They hate you, he said. They are alive to do it, she replied. That night, over stale coffee and a makeshift command post, Halden explained the part she hadn't put in her official report. Some of our people think we should walk away from places like this, she said. Too messy, too human. You can't shoot ideas out of a crowd the way you can bugs out of a lattice. But if we only help when it's clean, we'll end up letting rot fester because it's complicated. And complicated problems are where predators hide. Urith thought of the council again, of their perfect rules and their imperfect results. There will be systems that call this a violation, he said. There will be systems that are still here to call it anything at all, she answered. When the last aid corridor was secured and the moons could breathe without choking, the Alliance ships pulled back. No flags planted, no governments installed. Just stability, fragile as a newborn bird. The locals could still break it, but they would have to do it themselves. As the fleet prepared to depart, Urith received a message from an old colleague still seated in the Galactic Council. It was short. The Council condemns your intervention. They will bring formal charges if you return to core space. He deleted it without replying. From the viewport of the Lyrian flagship, he watched the moons shrink into points of light. Somewhere down there, someone would curse the Terrans for meddling. Somewhere else, a child would wake up without the sound of gunfire in her ears. The two truths would live side by side, and he was beginning to understand that this was the cost of real work. Halden's voice came over the private channel. Next stop's worse, you still in? He didn't hesitate. I'm in. The next set of coordinates brought them to a world that did not look like it needed saving. From orbit, the capital's towers gleamed in sunlight, their glass and steel catching the planetary ocean's reflection. The transport lanes were orderly cargo ships moving with measured precision. The agricultural belts were green and clean, irrigation channels straight as a ruler's edge. It was the kind of view planetary brochures sold to off-world investors. Looks peaceful, one of the Alliance captains said over the secure channel. Halden's reply was flat. It's not. The holomap flared with the intelligence packet. The government of Arden Prime had signed a non-aggression pact with the Heliarch network. In exchange for immunity from Seed Lattice deployment, they had agreed to harbor and shield Heliarch operatives moving through their space. Officially, there was no war here. Unofficially, Arden Prime had become a safe corridor for an enemy that devoured civilizations. They're not occupied, Urith said slowly, reading the brief. They're cooperating. Some people think feeding the wolf is safer than building a fence, Halden said. They are wrong. Eventually the wolf gets hungry enough to stop caring about the deal. The Alliance Task Force debated in tight circles. Some argued that intervention without a declaration of hostilities would cross a line even the Alliance had never stepped over. Others pointed out that allowing the Heliarch a secure pipeline was no different than surrendering a dozen neighboring systems. Urith broke the stalemate. If we let them choose their comfort over our survival, we are letting them decide for all of us. That's not sovereignty. That's surrender. Halden's plan was brutal in its simplicity. Infiltrate the capital's governmental network, identify the Heliarch operatives under Arden protection, remove them and the officials enabling them in a single sweep. The key, she said, was precision. We take only the infection, she told the strike commanders. No collateral, no martyrs they can use for propaganda. The Terran teams landed under the cover of an aid convoy, medical shipments bound for a joint training exercise, pre-approved by the Arden Foreign Ministry. They moved through the capital like smoke, each unit following data tags streaming from the Terran command ship. Urith accompanied one of the teams into the central assembly building. From the outside, it was a monument to civic pride. Marble steps, banners in the planetary colors rippling in a warm breeze. Inside, the air was heavy with the scent of polished stone and the quiet hum of expensive climate control. The first target was the Minister of Trade, a man Urith had met twice at council receptions. He was in the middle of a meeting when the Terrans entered, their armor matte and featureless. There were no shouted orders, no drawn weapons. Just a scanner passed over him, flashing a red pulse. One of the Terrans nodded once, and the minister was gone, teleported in a shimmer of light to a secure containment vessel aboard the Indomitable. It went on like that for hours. Ministers, judges, senior officers, even members of the Planetary Media Board, all flagged by the scanners, all removed without ceremony. The few who resisted were disarmed with a speed and restraint that left no permanent injury. Urith watched the list of cleared names grow until it reached 74. Then came the problem. The president of Arden Prime himself triggered the scanner's alarm. He didn't flinch. Instead, he smiled, a slow, knowing smile that made Urith's skin crawl. "Do you know what you're doing?" he asked the lead Terran operative. "Do you understand the chaos you'll unleash?" Halden's voice came over the comm. "Extract him." The president's voice didn't rise, but the venom in it carried. "Remove me and you will collapse the only government keeping this planet from tearing itself apart. You'll own everything that happens next. Every riot, every famine, every death." Urith could feel the weight of the moment. The scanners didn't lie, the president was compromised, but the truth in the man's threat was undeniable. Uprooting him would leave a vacuum no one here was ready to fill. "Admiral," Urith said into the comm, "what's your call?" "Same as it's been since we started this campaign," Halden replied. "We remove the infection. If the patient survives, they'll thank us. If they don't, they were already dead." The president vanished in a shimmer of light. By nightfall, Arden Prime's government was a shell. The remaining officials, those who cleared the scans, sat in emergency session, pale and shaking. Outside the assembly, crowds gathered, some shouting thanks, others cursing the off-world invasion. In the poorer districts, rumors swirled that the Alliance and Terrans would now seize control of the planet outright. Urith stood on the balcony of the assembly building, looking down at the unrest building in the streets. "They might not survive this," he said quietly. Halden stepped up beside him, her armor still dusted from the day's work. "Survival isn't always clean. Sometimes it's just the absence of something worse. Even if they never forgive us, they don't have to," she said. "They just have to be alive to try." When the Alliance fleet departed, Arden Prime was on the brink of chaos, but the Heliarch corridor was gone. The route they'd used to bypass frontline defenses had vanished overnight. Strategically, it was a victory. Morally, it was a scar. Back aboard the Indomitable, Halden summoned Urith to the wardroom. She was reviewing reports from half a dozen other systems. "This won't be the last time we find collaborators," she said without looking up. "The network's smart. They know fear is cheaper than war. You'll have to decide how far you're willing to go when fear dresses itself as peace." Urith thought of the president's smile, the certainty in his voice when he'd warned of the collapse. "How far are you willing to go, Admiral?" She met his gaze then, and for a moment he saw something raw behind her usual steel. "Far enough that I don't sleep well, but better that than sleep well while someone else's children burn." The call came in while the Indomitable was still days from Alliance space. It was a relay transmission from a scout ship patrolling the fringe of a border sector long written off by the Galactic Council as irrecoverable. The system's name was Kelaris, though most navigational charts marked it in gray, partially lost. Halden played the footage in the wardroom with no preamble. Grainy images resolved into a city scene from high orbit, the skyline fractured by the grotesque geometry of heliarch seed growths. The towers still standing were wrapped in silver filaments, their windows webbed over as if the city itself had been embalmed. But there were people moving in the streets, more than anyone expected to see in such a place. Some hurried in groups, carrying bundles and leading children. Others moved with the stiff, wrong rhythm that meant the network had rewritten them from the inside. "They're half gone," Halden said, "which means half still here." An Alliance captain leaned over the table. "If we hit hard enough to destroy the network presence, we'll kill civilians who haven't been converted. And if we go in soft," another said, "we risk letting the infection spread." Urith stared at the holo map. The infected zones were spreading from the center outward in a slow spiral. The uninfected neighborhoods were trapped in pockets, cut off from each other. Time was already against them. "How long before they are all gone?" he asked. 3 days, Halden said. 4 if they keep fighting." "Fighting?" Urith echoed. Halden zoomed the feed to show one of the uninfected sectors. Makeshift barricades blocked the streets, manned by armed civilians firing on approaching infected. Smoke curled from fires in side alleys. The people were holding, but barely. The room fell silent as the tactical options appeared. Each one was bad in a different way. Saturation bombardment could sterilize the infection, but it would kill tens of thousands of uninfected. A surgical ground operation would save more lives, but required entering the infected zones, fighting street to street, and risking Terran and Alliance troops being overrun. Urith broke the silence. "We go in on the ground, we pull them out." Halden's gaze met his, weighing his resolve. "Then understand this, if any of our teams get compromised, we put them down. If asked, no exceptions." He didn't flinch, understood. The drop into Kelaris was like falling into a nightmare that had learned how to breathe. The uninfected greeted the Terrans and Alliance soldiers with equal parts relief and disbelief, ushering them through barricades into narrow streets that reeked of smoke, fear, and the strange metallic tang that always followed the network's presence. The children's eyes were too wide. Their hands clutched too tightly to whatever they'd brought with them. Wooden toys, scraps of cloth, old photographs. The first contact with the infected came 6 blocks in. They moved fast, their bodies jerking in patterns that obeyed physics only loosely. Their faces were almost familiar, twisted by whatever lay behind their eyes. Urith saw one break into a sprint toward a group of evacuees, and in that moment he understood why Halden had given her warning. The Terran point man dropped the runner with a single shot, clean and final. There was no time for anything else. Progress was slow, methodical, and costly. The network had transformed parts of the city into labyrinths, buildings warped together with living cables that pulsed faintly. In one intersection, a Terran medic knelt over a wounded woman, scanning her frantically. The scanner flashed red. The medic froze for only a fraction of a second before she placed a hand on the woman's shoulder and whispered something Urith couldn't hear. Then the weapon's report ended the moment. "You keep moving," Halden told him quietly when she saw his expression. "If you start counting the faces, you stop walking." By the second day, they had evacuated nearly 30,000 uninfected, ferrying them through cleared corridors to the Alliance transports in orbit. But the network's spiral was closing. They began hitting the evac routes directly, throwing infected waves at the narrow, safe zones. The civilians who had been manning the barricades now fought alongside Alliance troops, firing from windows and rooftops as the Terrans pushed forward. The final push came at dawn on the third day. The last uninfected sector was down to 2 blocks, the surrounding buildings fully overtaken by network growth. Halden's teams went in first, breaching from 3 sides at once, their movements a blur of efficiency in the choking haze of the city's burning outskirts. Urith followed in the wake, helping direct evacuees to waiting shuttles. It was almost over when the alarms went up on the comm net. One of the Terran fire teams had gone silent. A minute later, their locator beacons flared inside a red zone. Urith didn't need anyone to explain what that meant. Halden didn't hesitate. Seal it, no one in or out. They might still, an Alliance officer started. They're gone, Halden said, her voice like steel snapping. Seal it. The charge went off 30 seconds later, collapsing the block into itself and burying everything, infected Terrans, buildings, under a cloud of dust and silence. When it was over, the uninfected were gone from Kelaris, not all of them alive, not all of them whole, but gone from the spiral's reach. The infected, every last one, had been erased. Back aboard the Indomitable, Urith stood in the observation deck, watching the ruined city recede into the dark. "You were right," he said finally, "about not counting the faces." Halden was quiet for a long time. When she spoke, her voice was low. "The ones we lost down there, they knew what they were walking into. They went anyway. That's the job. You save what you can, and you live with what you can't." He nodded, but the truth sat heavy. Saving half meant losing half, and in the quiet between missions, it was too easy to hear the voices of the ones they hadn't reached. The next briefing came with a weight everyone in the wardroom could feel before the first word was spoken. Halden stood at the head of the table, the holo map casting its pale light across her face. The target system pulsed in red at the heart of the projection, but unlike every other mission before, this one was bordered by heavy gold lines. "That," Halden said, tapping the golden perimeter, "is the Meridian Pact's frontier." The Meridian Pact wasn't just any neutral civilization. It was one of the galaxy's most technologically advanced polities, fiercely independent and armed to the teeth. They'd stayed out of every major war for centuries, enforcing their neutrality with a mix of trade dominance and the credible promise of overwhelming retaliation against any trespass. Crossing their border without permission wasn't just illegal under the core accords. It was the kind of act that could start a war no one could win. Urith read the briefing data with growing dread. And inside those borders, Halden zoomed the view. The heart of the Pact's agricultural zone was infected. 2 major worlds and a chain of orbital processing stations were in the early stages of Heliarch seed deployment. The infection wasn't visible from the Pact's public channels. No images, no warnings, nothing to suggest they even knew what was growing beneath the surface. "Either they don't see it," Halden said, "or they are hiding it." An Alliance Commodore frowned. "The Pact will treat any intrusion as an act of war, even a rescue mission. And if we wait for them to ask for help?" Halden asked. Urith answered before anyone else could. "By the time they admit they need it, it will be too late." The room fell into a deep, uneasy silence. The mission was clear, but the consequences could fracture the Alliance, ignite a war with the most dangerous neutral state in the galaxy, and hand the Council every argument it needed to paint the Terrans as reckless destabilizers. Halden finally broke the silence. "We go in quiet. No broadcasts, no fleet massing at the border. Stealth insertion, multiple teams, fast and invisible. If they catch us..." She didn't finish the sentence. The insertion was tense from the first moment. Terran stealth ships folded into the Pact's frontier space, slipping under their automated defense grids with maneuvers that bent the math of detection. Urith rode in the lead ship, the deck lights low, every crew member speaking in clipped whispers as though the Pact's sensors could hear their breath. The first planet was worse than the holo images had prepared him for. From orbit, the farmland still looked lush. the processing towers gleaming in the sun. But infrared overlays told the truth. Thousands of small, regular heat blooms just beneath the soil, each one a seed lattice node gestating toward activation. The heliarch had hidden them under the very fields that fed billions. Halden's voice came over the comm. We split into 4 teams, hit the densest clusters first. Every hour we wait, more civilians go from unknowing to unrecoverable. The operation was fast, surgical, and silent. Terran ground teams moved through the fields at night, their presence visible only in the brief flare of a cutting torch or the dim shimmer of a teleport pulse, as another infected node was dismantled. By dawn, 2/3 of the clusters were gone. But stealth missions always carry the risk of a single slip. On the 3rd night, a packed patrol drone caught a fleeting glimpse of a Terran strike team withdrawing from an infected processing facility. Within an hour, the entire sector was lit up with alert beacons. Urith felt the atmosphere shift aboard the stealth ship. The crew worked faster, quieter, every motion sharpened by the knowledge that the clock had just run out. The Pact's response was immediate. Orbital defense ships began sweeping the area, their sensor nets tightening like a noose. A hailing frequency blasted through every channel in system. Unidentified vessels, you are violating Meridian Pact sovereignty. Power down and prepare to be boarded. Halden didn't even slow her pace on the operations deck. Finish the clusters. We leave when the job's done. An Alliance officer's voice crackled in protest over the secure channel. If they catch you inside their borders, it's war. Halden's tone was cold iron. If we leave those clusters, it's genocide. They finished with minutes to spare. The last infected node went up in a controlled burn as Terran ships began their exfiltration run, darting between the tightening lines of Pact patrols. The escape was so close Urith could feel the hum of the enemy's targeting sensors brushing the ship's shields before they folded back into Alliance space. 3 hours later, the first public reports hit the galactic news nets. The Meridian Pact's own agricultural ministry announced the successful neutralization of a localized biocontamination threat, crediting their own security forces for the operation. There was no mention of the Terrans, the Alliance, or the fact that without intervention, billions of their citizens would have been converted before the month was out. Halden watched the broadcast without expression. They'll never thank us, that's fine. Urith shook his head. They'll never admit they needed us. That's fine too, Halden said. Admitting you needed help is harder than surviving. In the weeks that followed, the Council fumed, the Pact filed formal protests, and Alliance diplomats worked themselves raw trying to keep the incident from boiling into open conflict. But in the quiet places where decisions were really made, every strategist knew the truth. The Terrans had saved the Pact from itself, and from the heliarch, without firing a single shot at their navy. When the next set of coordinates came through, Urith didn't even ask where they led. He simply boarded the Indomitable. The line between legality and survival had blurred so completely that he no longer pretended to see it. The message came with no encryption, no signature, no attempt at disguise. It was simply a flood of sensor data from forward probes scattered along the Alliance frontier. An incoming wave of heliarch vessels so vast it looked less like a fleet and more like a tide. The formation wasn't aimed at any single system. It was fanning outward, a deliberate sweep that would hit multiple targets at once, overloading any chance of coordinated defense. Halden stood in the Indomitable's operations center, the entire tactical wall awash in red markers. "This isn't a campaign," she said flatly. "It's a message. They want to prove that fighting them is worse than surrendering." The Alliance commanders in the holo room were grim. The heliarch weren't coming to occupy or cede, they were coming to burn. And their choice of targets was calculated to break morale, newly liberated systems, worlds still recovering, even the Meridian Pact's frontier, places where survival was fresh enough to still feel fragile. "They mean to make examples," Urith said. "Show the galaxy that resistance is hopeless." Halden didn't disagree. Then we don't just stop them, we make it so no one even believes they could succeed. She outlined the plan in sparse, brutal strokes. The Alliance fleets would defend the most vulnerable systems. The Terrans would take the fight directly into the heart of the Heliarch formation, aiming to destroy their command nodes before the outer fleets could coordinate their burn. It was risky. Cutting into the middle of a swarm meant being surrounded, with no retreat route that didn't cross enemy lines twice. The operation began before the Council could debate it, before the news networks could saturate the galaxy with panic. Terran warships folded straight into the central axis of the swarm, their black hulls vanishing against the starfield until they lit up with weapons fire. The opening salvo ripped through 3 command carriers before the Heliarch realized what was happening. The response was instant and overwhelming. Vessels the size of cities pivoted toward the intruders, lancing the void with beams that turned space itself into a weapon. The Indomitable took 2 direct hits in the first exchange, her shields flaring so bright they left afterimages in Urith's vision. Still, Haldan's voice over the comm was steady, clipped, giving orders in a rhythm that made chaos obey. On the outer fronts, the Alliance fought a desperate holding action. Urith could hear fragments of their comm chatter between bursts of static. Evacuation orders, damage reports, the bark of commanders rallying their crews. Every minute they held bought the Terrans another strike at the swarm's core. It became a brutal rhythm. Slip through their formation, hit a command node, slip out before the converging claws closed. Over and over, each run costing more. Ships went dark and didn't come back. Names scrolled on the casualty lists before the tactical feeds could catch up. Then came the moment that broke the tide. A deep space reconnaissance frigate, the TCS Harbinger, emerged from a fold jump inside the swarm's densest cluster. Instead of running, she charged straight into the largest command carrier still active, her drives burning white-hot. The impact lit the void like a newborn sun. When the flare faded, the carrier was gone, and the swarm's cohesion began to fracture. Haldan didn't waste it. All units, press the gap, break them now. The Terrans surged forward, driving through the disoriented enemy vessels with a ferocity that made even the Heliarch scatter. One by one, their formations dissolved into isolated pockets, each picked apart by Alliance ships closing in from the flanks. By the time the last Heliarch ship folded out, the field was nothing but wreckage and drifting silence. The battle had lasted 19 hours. In that time, the Terrans had lost 12 ships, nearly a quarter of their strike force. The Alliance had taken heavy losses on the outer fronts, but had held every target world. Not a single civilian colony had burned. In the aftermath, the galaxy was a strange mix of relief and fury. The liberated systems celebrated openly. The Council convened emergency sessions to demand explanations, condemn unauthorized escalation, debate whether the destruction of the swarm counted as a provocation for further conflict. The Meridian Pact released a statement claiming their borders had never been breached, carefully avoiding any mention of the Terrans' role in saving them twice. In the Indomitable's wardroom, Urith found Haldan alone, staring at the tactical replay in silence. "They'll remember this," he said. She glanced at him, one eyebrow raised. "Who?" "The ones who lived, even if they never say it, even if they tell themselves they did it alone. Somewhere, deep down, they'll remember who was there." Haldan's mouth tilted into something between a smile and exhaustion. "Maybe, but it's not why we came." "I know," Urith said, "but it matters." The ship's comm chimed with a priority transmission. It was from one of the Alliance's newest member worlds, one that had once hesitated to commit forces to the fight. The message was simple: "If you ever need us, we'll come." Haldan read it once, then shut it off. "One day, Chancellor, will be gone for good, and when that day comes, I hope you've all learned enough to not need us." Urith thought of the faces he'd seen on 100 worlds, grateful, defiant, angry, alive. He thought of the law as it had been, of the laws they might yet write. "We're learning," he said. "Not fast enough, but we are." Outside the viewport, the wreckage of the swarm drifted in slow, silent arcs, the stars beyond sharp and cold. Somewhere past them lay the edge of every map, and beyond that the place the Terrans would go next. Not for glory, not for thanks, just because someone would need them. And when they came, the galaxy would remember, whether it wanted to or not.